The crystal chandelier cast a sharp, fractured light across the private dining room at L'Etoile, throwing long shadows against the textured silk wallpaper. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering Chicago skyline stood stark against the November night, entirely indifferent to the suffocating tension building inside our enclosed space. The air smelled faintly of roasted truffles and aged wine, a rich, heady scent that usually indicated celebration. For me, it only signaled a trap. It was my mother's 60th birthday. Eleanor sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, draped in a burgundy silk gown that looked expensive enough to demand absolute respect from anyone who dared walk past. She held court with the effortless entitlement of a woman who believed the world existed solely to cater to her every passing whim. I sat at the absolute farthest end of the table. The placement was not an accident. It was a physical manifestation of my standing in this family. For the past 2 hours, I had been practically invisible. I sipped my sparkling water, tracing the rim of the glass with my thumb, while the conversation flowed around me like water parting around a stone. My older brother Marcus was positioned directly to Eleanor's right, the golden child. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling a glass of scotch, holding the room captive with another exaggerated story about his latest business venture. His tailored suit strained slightly across his shoulders as he gestured wildly, laughing too loud at his own jokes. My younger sister Chloe sat across from him, nodding eagerly at every word, desperate for a fraction of the approval Marcus hoarded. Whenever I tried to speak to offer a simple compliment about the food or a polite question about someone's life, Eleanor would casually turn her head. She would ask the waiter for more ice or compliment Chloe on her earrings. It was a masterclass in passive aggression. I was there because it looked good for the family image to have all 3 children present for a milestone birthday. But I was not there to be heard. I was there to be an audience to Marcus's greatness. The plates from the 7th course were cleared away by a small army of waiters moving in silent synchronization. The air in the room grew thicker. The dessert plates were empty. The espresso cups were drained. It was time for the performance to reach its climax. The maitre d' approached the table with a sleek black leather folder, stepping softly across the imported rugs. He aimed instinctively for Marcus, recognizing the loudest voice in the room, as the presumed host, a mistake anyone would make just by listening to him for 5 minutes. Marcus took the folder with a magnanimous nod, flipping it open. I watched his eyes scan the bottom line. The bill for a private room, vintage wines, and a customized tasting menu for 12 people at a 3-Michelin-star restaurant was never going to be subtle. Marcus let out a low whistle, a sound designed specifically to draw everyone's attention. The chatter around the table stopped completely. Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of pride and expectation. "Well," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the sudden quiet, "looks like we did some damage tonight." He stood up slowly, picking up the heavy leather folder. He didn't pull out a wallet. He didn't reach for a pen. Instead, he walked the length of the long table, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Every eye in the room followed him. I kept my gaze fixed on my empty water glass, my heart beginning a slow, steady drumbeat against my ribs. I knew exactly what he was doing. Marcus stopped directly behind my chair. The scent of his expensive cologne hung heavy in the air, cloying and sharp. He leaned down, placing his hands on the back of my chair, trapping me in place. 10 grand, Marcus said, dropping the leather folder directly onto the center of my pristine white plate. It landed with a dull thud. I didn't flinch. I looked down at the receipt peeking out from the leather flap. $10,240. Since you've been sitting here all night contributing absolutely nothing, Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. And since you're still a struggling nobody trying to figure your life out, I thought we could do you a favor. Consider this a learning opportunity. He patted my shoulder, digging his fingers in just a little too hard. You can figure out how to cover the tip he sneered. "Make yourself useful for once, Maya. Prove you belong at this table." The table erupted into a chorus of forced, uncomfortable chuckles. Chloe actually clapped her hands over her mouth to hide a vicious little smile. Eleanor simply raised her wineglass to her lips, her eyes locking onto mine over the crystal rim, waiting to watch me break. They expected tears. They expected me to stammer, to pull out a maxed-out debit card with shaking hands, to humiliate myself, begging for them to cover it. The heat of their collective stare pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. But I didn't feel the heat of the restaurant. I felt the biting, merciless cold of a November night 16 years ago. The memory crashed over me so vivid and sharp, I could almost feel the freezing rain stinging my cheeks and soaking into my skin. I was 18 years old. I was standing on the front porch of our sprawling suburban home, shivering uncontrollably in a thin denim jacket that offered no protection against the bitter wind. My teeth were chattering so violently my jaw ached with the effort of holding them still. The porch light was burned out, leaving me entirely in the dark shadows, while the warm, inviting glow of the living room mocked me from behind the glass. Eleanor stood in the doorway, blocking the warmth of the house. Her face was a mask of cold, unyielding fury. Marcus had just confessed to racking up a massive debt with an illegal sports betting ring. The bookies had called the house. The family was facing a scandal. And Eleanor's solution had been simple. I was to empty the college fund I had spent 4 years working part-time jobs to build and hand it over to save her golden boy. When I whispered the word no, her eyes had gone dead. "You selfish, ungrateful child," Eleanor had spat, her voice cutting through the freezing rain. "Your brother is in trouble. This family protects its own. If you won't do your part, you don't belong in this house." She shoved a crumpled wad of cash into my freezing, trembling hands. It was exactly $150. "Take this and get out," she commanded. "Don't come back until you learn what family means." The heavy oak door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sound like a gunshot echoing loudly in the quiet, upscale neighborhood. I stood on that porch for 2 hours in the freezing rain, my clothes soaked through to my skin, clutching that meager handful of cash. I kept waiting for a mother who would never open the door, hoping against hope that she would realize she was throwing her own daughter away. The sharp clink of silverware snapped me back to the present. I was not 18 anymore. I was not standing in the freezing rain, and I was not afraid. I looked up from the leather folder. Marcus was still standing beside me, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He crossed his arms over his chest, glancing toward Eleanor to make sure she was enjoying the show. The silence in the room had stretched on too long. It was meant to crush me, to force me into a panicked apology. Instead, I felt a profound, absolute calm wash over my entire body. It was a cold, quiet stillness that terrified people who didn't understand it. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to defend my dignity. I didn't look at my mother for mercy. I reached down to the floor and picked up my purse. It was a simple, unmarked leather bag, free of the flashy logos my mother and sister so desperately craved. I opened the clasp and reached inside. The room held its collective breath. I could hear Marcus let out a soft, mocking sigh, clearly preparing a speech about how I shouldn't bother pulling out a card that was just going to decline. I bypassed my standard credit cards. My fingers brushed against the heavy, cool metal hidden in the specialized inner pocket. I pulled it out and set it gently on top of the receipt. It didn't make the soft plastic tapping sound of a regular credit card. It hit the table with a distinct heavy clink of solid titanium. The sleek, matte black surface absorbed the light from the chandelier above. There were no raised numbers, no flashy banks advertised across the front. Just a single subtle emblem, and my name engraved in smooth silver lettering. An American Express Centurion card, the black card. Not the kind you apply for, the kind you are invited to hold only when your net worth requires a dedicated team of private wealth managers. The waiter, who had been hovering discreetly near the heavy oak door all evening, stepped forward instantly. He didn't look at Marcus, who was still standing awkwardly over me. He didn't look at my mother, whose triumphant smile was already beginning to slip. His highly trained eyes recognized the heavy black metal, immediately understanding exactly what it represented. He reached down and picked up the leather folder with a profound, almost reverent silence. "Right away, Ms. Wilson," the waiter murmured, giving me a short, deferential bow before turning and walking briskly out of the private room. Marcus's arms slowly uncrossed. His smirk faltered, replaced by a strange, slack-jawed confusion. He stared at the empty space on my plate where the bill had been, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. Chloe leaned forward, squinting across the table. Wait, what did she just hand him? I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked gently against the crystal. It was the loudest sound in the room. A minute later, the waiter returned. He bypassed Marcus entirely. He walked straight to the end of the table and presented the silver tray directly to me. The heavy black card sat next to the finalized receipt. I picked up the provided pen, added a $3,000 tip without a flicker of hesitation, and signed my name with a smooth, fluid stroke. I slid the titanium card back into my purse and looked down the length of the table. Eleanor was not looking at Marcus. She was staring directly at me. The smug satisfaction that had rested on her features all evening had vanished completely. The blood had drained from her face, leaving her pale and rigid beneath her expensive makeup. Her eyes darted from my perfectly calm expression to my leather purse, her mind visibly racing through desperate, panicked calculations that made no sense to her. How could the daughter she discarded possibly possess something she herself could never qualify for? Her shock began to morph, twisting rapidly into a dark, ugly suspicion. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white as she leaned forward. "Maya!" Eleanor demanded, her voice loud and trembling with accusation. "What kind of illegal, degrading things have you been doing to get your hands on a stolen credit card?" The question hung in the air, toxic and heavy. My mother's perfectly manicured fingers gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles blanched. She wasn't just asking a question. She was throwing a lifeline to her own shattering reality. Chloe seized it instantly. She leaned across her half-eaten dessert, her eyes narrowing with a vicious sort of glee. "Oh, please, Mom." "Isn't it obvious?" Chloe let out a sharp, breathless laugh. She found herself a sugar daddy, some desperate old man who lets her carry around his card to play dress-up for the night. I looked at my younger sister. At 28, Chloe was still playing the exact same role she had mastered in high school. She was the cruel, eager understudy to our mother's relentless judgment. She looked so desperate to believe her own lie. "I mean, look at her," Chloe continued, her voice rising, seeking validation from the rest of the table. "Maya hasn't said a word about a career. She hasn't brought a +1. You really think she earned a black card? She probably has to return it before midnight." I didn't defend myself. I didn't raise my voice to list my degrees, my 80-hour work weeks, or the sleepless years I spent building my holding firm from a tiny, windowless office. Defending myself would mean playing their game. It would mean acknowledging that their opinions still held weight. Instead, I simply picked up my crystal water glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the silence stretch out, allowing their venomous assumptions to echo around the private dining room. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The golden child was not used to sharing the spotlight, and my sheer refusal to react was sucking all the oxygen out of the room. He hated it. He needed to be the center of gravity, the undisputed king of Eleanor's world. "Let it go, Chloe," Marcus said loudly, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. He forced a loud, booming laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Who cares whose money she is spending? If some old fool wants to fund her little fantasies, let her have her fun. It is fake wealth. It is not built. It is borrowed." Eleanor exhaled a long, shaky breath, her posture immediately relaxing. Marcus had provided the exact rationalization she desperately needed. She smoothed the front of her burgundy silk gown and offered him a look of profound maternal gratitude. "You are absolutely right, Marcus," Eleanor said, her tone instantly returning to its usual imperious cadence. She shot me a look of pure disdain. "Real success requires intellect. It requires pedigree. It requires actual hard work." "Exactly," Marcus said, leaning back and snapping his fingers at a passing waiter. "Hey, buddy, bring me another Macallan." "Neat. And make it quick this time. Your service tonight has been entirely unacceptable." The young waiter flushed, nodding tightly before hurrying away. I watched Marcus demean the young man without a second thought. It was a classic Marcus maneuver. Whenever he felt insecure, he found someone in a subordinate position to crush under his heel. It was pathetic, but to Eleanor and Chloe, it was a display of power. "Speaking of actual hard work," Marcus announced, his chest puffing out as he addressed the table. "Let's talk about something that actually matters. My new tech startup is officially entering its next phase. We just finalized the lease on our new corporate headquarters." Eleanor clapped her hands together, her eyes shining with genuine adoration. "Oh, Marcus, that is wonderful news. Tell us everything." "It is not just an office," Marcus boasted, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "It is a statement. We secured the entire top floor of the Sterling building right in the financial district. Floor-to-ceiling glass, private elevators. It is the kind of space that tells investors we are the next big thing." I kept my face perfectly still, but beneath the table my fingers curled into my palms. The Sterling building. He was bragging about a commercial high-rise located at 400 West Madison. It was a beautiful piece of modern architecture featuring premium corporate suites and a notoriously strict leasing board. It was also a building that my venture capital holding firm Apex Equities had formally acquired exactly 3 days ago. Marcus continued talking, his voice echoing loudly off the silk-lined walls. He bragged about the custom Italian leather chairs he had ordered for the boardroom. He bragged about the espresso bar and the panoramic views of the Chicago River. He went on and on about how much the lease cost, inflating the numbers to make himself sound even more important. "It is a brutal lease," Marcus said, swirling his fresh glass of scotch. "They demand a premium. But when you are operating at my level, you do not flinch at the price tag. You just sign the check. The landlord knows we are the anchor tenant. They practically begged us to take the space." I took another sip of my water to hide the slight involuntary curve of my lips. He had no idea. He was sitting across from the woman who literally owned the roof over his head. "That is my brilliant boy," Eleanor beamed, raising her wineglass toward him. "You are building an empire, Marcus. You are carrying on your father's legacy exactly as he always intended." That sentence hit me like a physical blow. The mention of my father's legacy. It was a sick, twisted joke, considering Eleanor had manipulated the legal system to steal my rightful share of that exact legacy. She had stolen it just to fund Marcus's endless delusions of grandeur. But I didn't let the anger show. I let it fuel me. I watched them toast to his fake empire, their glasses clinking in a hollow celebration of a man who was nothing more than a parasite wearing a tailored suit. Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with syrupy sweetness. "It must be so nice to have real self-made wealth, to actually own something substantial." She shot a pointed glance in my direction. Instead of just pretending, I smiled gently at my younger sister. "It is," I said quietly. "It really is." My calm response seemed to infuriate her further, but before she could launch another verbal attack, the maitre d' appeared. He bowed slightly to Eleanor, politely informing us that our private room reservation was coming to an end. The spell of the dinner was broken. Chairs scraped against the hardwood floor as everyone began to gather their coats and bags. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and unspoken resentment. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress. I felt grounded. For 16 years, the memory of being thrown out into the freezing rain had been a source of deep, lingering pain. But tonight, Watching them desperately cling to their fragile superiority, I realized they were entirely powerless against me. Marcus walked around the table, his confident swagger fully restored. He stopped in front of me, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket. He looked me up and down, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. "It was cute seeing you try to play with the big kids tonight," Maya Marcus said. His voice dropped to a low, mocking pitch so only I could hear. "But fake plastic only gets you so far." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick, textured business card. The edges were gilded in gold. He pressed it directly into my hand, tapping it twice with his index finger. "Listen," Marcus said, his eyes filled with a toxic fake pity. "When your sugar daddy gets bored and cuts you off, you are going to need a real job. Keep that card. If you ever need to make some honest money, drop by my new office. I might have a spot for you answering phones at the front desk." I looked down at the card. The address of the Sterling Building was printed in bold, embossed letters right beneath his name. I didn't throw the card back at him. I didn't slap his smug face. I carefully slid his gold-embossed business card into my purse, right next to my titanium Centurion card. I looked up, meeting his arrogant gaze with a warm, unwavering smile. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "That is very generous of you. I will be paying your office a visit very soon." The polished marble floors of the Sterling Building echoed with the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels. I bypassed the main reception desk, entirely ignoring the questioning look of the security guard, and stepped directly into the private executive elevator. I swiped my key card over the hidden sensor plate. The digital display blinked a steady green, granting me immediate access to the penthouse level. Marcus had spared absolutely no expense outfitting his new headquarters. When the elevator doors glided open, they revealed a sprawling, open-concept floor plan dripping in manufactured prestige. It was a space designed to intimidate. There were massive living moss walls requiring daily maintenance, imported Italian leather sofas scattered throughout the waiting area, and a fully stocked, custom-built barista bar. It was a beautiful, breathtaking illusion. It was also entirely built on borrowed time. I walked past his front desk receptionist without a single word. My target was the massive glass-walled conference room situated in the absolute center of the floor, raised slightly above the rest of the office like an observation deck. Marcus was inside, pacing at the head of a long, pristine quartz table. He was surrounded by 6 executives, all in expensive suits, nodding furiously as he waved his hands in the air to emphasize some invisible point. I didn't bother knocking. I wrapped my fingers around the heavy steel handle, pushed the glass door open, and stepped inside the climate-controlled room. The conversation died instantly. 6 heads turned in my direction, eyes wide with varying degrees of shock and confusion at the sudden interruption. Marcus stopped mid-stride. The confident, easy smile on his face vanished, replaced by a flush of violent irritation the exact second he recognized who had walked into his sanctuary. He let out a loud, theatric groan. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, pinching his eyes shut, as if he were dealing with an unruly, trespassing vagrant. He looked around at his executive team, practically inviting them to share in his engineered, exaggerated exhaustion. "Unbelievable," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the harsh, jagged edge of a man who loved playing to an audience. "I give her a business card out of pity, and she actually shows up looking for a handout." He leaned heavily over the quartz table, resting his weight on his knuckles. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, checking me up and down as if inspecting my shoes for mud. "Maya, I am in the middle of a vital board meeting," he said, speaking slowly and enunciating every syllable as if I had trouble understanding basic English. "I told you last night that I might have a spot for you answering phones. I didn't tell you to crash my executive floor, bypass my security, and interrupt actual professionals." One of the younger men at the table chuckled nervously, eager to please the boss. Marcus thrived on that kind of sycophantic validation. It fed his ego like oxygen to a fire. "Security can escort you down to the lobby," Marcus continued, waving a dismissive hand toward the door. "Leave your sad little resume at the front desk. If my HR team approves, maybe I can scrape together a few minimum wage hours for you. Now get out of my boardroom." I didn't move. I didn't blink. I simply walked forward, closing the distance between the glass door and the edge of his immaculate quartz table. The silence in the room shifted dramatically. The nervous amusement of the executives curdled into a thick, suffocating tension. The air grew suddenly heavy. They could sense with the instinct of men whose livelihoods depended on reading the room that something was deeply and fundamentally wrong. I stopped directly across from Marcus. I reached into my bag, unhurried and perfectly calm, and pulled out a thick, sealed manila folder. I placed it gently onto the glass surface. I didn't slide it toward him. I just let it sit there between us, a physical manifestation of an incoming storm. "I am not here for a job, Marcus," I said. My voice was quiet. It was stripped of any lingering sisterly affection, any anger or any fear. It rang clearly through the dead air of the conference room, cold and absolute. I looked away from his furious face, letting my gaze drift over the terrified, silent faces of his executive team. I offered them a polite, strictly professional smile. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, folding my hands in front of me. "My name is Maya. I am the founder and sole owner of Apex Equities." The name hit the room like a physical shockwave. The chief financial officer, a graying man sitting to Marcus's immediate left, visibly recoiled. He actually dropped his expensive silver pen, letting it clatter loudly against the table. Every single person in that room knew the name Apex Equities. They knew it was the massive multinational holding firm that had just purchased the Sterling building 3 days ago. "I believe your accounting department is quite familiar with my company," I continued, smoothly turning my attention back to Marcus. "As I mentioned, we officially acquired this commercial high-rise, which makes me your new landlord." Marcus stared at me. His mouth hung slightly open. His brain was completely short-circuiting as it tried to process the impossible, crushing weight of the information I had just dropped on him. He looked from me to the thick manila folder and back to my face, searching for a punchline that wasn't coming. "That's a lie," Marcus stammered. His voice suddenly lacked its booming, arrogant authority. It sounded thin and hollow. "You don't own Apex. That's a billion-dollar firm. You're just Maya." I rested my fingertips on the edge of the manila folder and pushed it exactly 1 inch closer to his chest. "Open it," I commanded. Marcus hesitated. His bravado was rapidly fracturing, crumbling into a pathetic, desperate fear. He reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. The very first page was a certified deed of transfer. The second document was the master lease agreement for the penthouse floor. Both bore my signature in dark blue ink, legally binding and irrefutable. I watched the color drain completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. The muscles in his jaw twitched. He couldn't speak. So I spoke for him. "This office space is truly spectacular, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing off the pristine glass walls. The living moss walls, the imported leather furniture, the private catered lunches I saw being delivered downstairs. It really sells the grand illusion that you are running a highly successful, profoundly profitable enterprise. I leaned slightly forward, making sure I held the undivided attention of every executive in the room. "The problem is," I continued, "expensive illusions do not pay the commercial rent. And according to the deep financial audit my acquisitions team completed 48 hours ago, your company is completely broke." The executives gasped. The CFO buried his face in his hands, letting out a ragged groan. Marcus had clearly been lying to his own team about the company's financial runway, projecting a false reality while driving them off a cliff. You are currently 3 months behind on a lease that costs $80,000 a month. I said, stripping away his dignity layer by agonizing layer. You are bleeding cash. Your vendors are threatening to freeze services. Your server space is delinquent. You are operating a hollow shell of a company, Marcus, and you are using my building to put on a theatrical play. You can't do this, Marcus whispered. His eyes darted frantically around the room, desperate to save face in front of the men he had just been trying to dominate. The sweat beaded on his forehead. We're family. We can work out a lease extension. I just need a little more time to secure the next funding round. Family protects its own, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. It was an echo of the exact words Eleanor had used when she threw me into the freezing rain 16 years ago. And right now, I am protecting my investments. I reached into the back of the folder and pulled out a single crisp white sheet of paper. I placed it directly on top of his open ledger, right where he couldn't look away from it. This is a formal, legally binding 14-day pay or quit eviction notice. I stated, my tone offering zero room for negotiation. You have exactly 2 weeks to produce the $240,000 you owe me in back rent. If those funds do not clear my corporate accounts by the end of the 14th day, my private security team will lock your elevators, seize your physical assets, and forcefully empty this entire floor. Marcus stared down at the eviction notice. His chest heaved as genuine, unfiltered panic set in. He looked completely cornered, like a trapped animal realizing the steel jaws had just snapped shut on its leg. But then, as I watched his erratic breathing, something shifted. The pure terror in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by a sudden sickening realization. He straightened his posture, rolling his shoulders back. The blood returned to his face. A dark, nasty smirk began to curl at the corners of his mouth, stretching into a look of absolute, unearned victory. He picked up the eviction notice between 2 fingers and flicked it casually back onto the glass table. 240 grand. Marcus chuckled, a wet, ugly sound that sent a spike of warning through my chest. Is that supposed to scare me? You really think you've got me backed into a corner, Maya? He leaned across the glass, his face inches from mine, his eyes gleaming with a toxic, triumphant malice. You're too late, Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with venomous joy. Mom called me this morning. She just unlocked the hidden family trust Dad left behind. She's wiring me $2 million by Friday from an account you have absolutely no legal right to touch. The words hidden family trust hit the glass of the conference room like a physical blow. I didn't flinch. I kept my breathing slow and measured, watching Marcus bask in his own manufactured glory. He was practically vibrating with toxic joy, utterly convinced he had just played the ultimate trump card. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my pulse spike. I offered him a tight, polite smile. Friday should be a very interesting day then, Marcus, I said softly. I turned on my heel and walked out. I didn't look back at the pale, sweating executives or at the expensive moss wall that was currently draining my building's water supply. I kept my posture perfect until the private elevator doors slid shut, sealing me inside the polished steel cab. The moment I was alone, the pristine facade dropped. I gripped the brass handrail, my knuckles turning white. A hidden family trust. My father passed away when I was 16. Eleanor had sat me down in the kitchen, her eyes dry, and told me the medical bills had completely consumed the estate. She swore there was nothing left. I had spent the next 2 years working double shifts at a diner just to afford community college textbooks. I had believed her without question. By the time I stepped into the grand marble lobby of the Sterling Building, my shock had entirely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, searing clarity. I pulled my phone from my purse and bypassed my executive assistant. I dialed the direct line for David, the head of my forensic accounting division at Apex Equities. David, I said, stepping out into the brisk Chicago wind, I need you to drop whatever merger you are currently vetting. Pull every available resource. I need to find an estate lawyer named Arthur Vance. Finding Arthur took less than 3 hours. He was 72 now, long retired, and living in a quiet, affluent suburb overlooking the lake. My legal team sent a black car to collect him. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Arthur was sitting nervously in my primary conference room at Apex headquarters. He looked incredibly small, surrounded by the vast modern architecture of my firm. I slid a cup of black coffee across the polished mahogany table toward him. When he looked up at me, his eyes widened with a mixture of recognition and profound guilt. "Maya," Arthur whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the ceramic mug. "You look so much like him." I didn't offer a warm reunion. I simply asked him to explain the trust my father left behind. Arthur looked down at the massive stack of archived legal boxes my team had already couriered over from the county clerk's office. He took a slow, heavy breath and began pulling files. The truth buried under 16 years of dust and legal jargon was sickeningly simple. My father had been a quiet, careful man. He knew Eleanor's spending habits, and he certainly knew Marcus's complete lack of discipline. He had set up an ironclad trust meant to protect us. It was designed to be divided into 3 exactly equal shares, only accessible when each child reached their 25th birthday. "It was a beautiful estate, Maya," Arthur said, his voice cracking with regret. "He wanted to make sure you never had to worry about your education or your future." "Then why didn't I receive a single dime?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. David, my lead accountant, slid a heavily redacted document across the mahogany table. It was a sworn, notarized affidavit. I stared down at the crisp white page. 16 years ago, Eleanor had marched into family court and filed a petition to restructure the trust. She claimed I was a runaway. She declared me violently estranged and legally unfit to manage my own affairs. Right below her signature was mine. It was a complex waiver relinquishing my entire third of the estate into a discretionary fund controlled solely by Eleanor. I stared at the dark blue ink. The signature was a decent forgery, but the loop on the Y was entirely wrong. It was clearly Marcus's handwriting. I checked the date stamped at the top of the page. It was filed exactly 3 weeks after that freezing November night. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Eleanor hadn't just thrown me out of the house because she was angry about Marcus's gambling debts. She threw me out so she could create the legal precedent of abandonment. She needed me gone so she could steal my future to pay for his mistakes. For the last 16 years, she had systematically bled my father's legacy dry. Every failed app Marcus launched, every luxury car he leased, every lavish vacation Chloe bragged about online. It was all funded by the money my father had carefully saved for me. And the $2 million Marcus was expecting on Friday was the very last drop of it. I closed my eyes. The heavy scent of the leather chairs in my boardroom vanished. For a split second, I was back on that dark porch. I could feel the biting winter wind slicing through my thin denim jacket. I could feel the wet, crumpled texture of the $150 she had shoved into my freezing hands. That was what my mother had decided my entire life was worth. $150 and a slammed door. I opened my eyes. The crushing weight of the grief was gone. The hurt, the longing for a family I never truly had, evaporated into the climate-controlled air of the room. I looked at David, and then at my lead corporate litigator. "I want them dismantled," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "We can file an emergency injunction on the wire transfer by tomorrow morning," my lawyer said, taking furious notes. "We will freeze the remaining trust assets pending a full investigation." "Do it," I commanded. "And I want an airtight case for grand larceny, forgery, and wire fraud. Trace every single dollar Eleanor pulled from that account. Build a legal mechanism so perfectly engineered that when it snaps shut, it breaks every bone in their financial bodies." David nodded grimly, already organizing the fraudulent documents into evidence piles. "We'll pull the transaction histories tonight, Maya. We won't leave a single stone unturned." I thanked Arthur for his time ensuring a private car took him safely back home. I stayed in the office long after the sun dipped below the skyline, watching my team tear through decades of my family's financial sins. I didn't feel vindictive. I just felt a profound necessary obligation to deliver absolute justice. It was past midnight when I finally returned to my penthouse apartment. The city below was quiet, wrapped in the dark, heavy silence of the early morning hours. I poured myself a glass of red wine and stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glowing grid of the streets. I was just beginning to let my shoulders relax when my cell phone vibrated violently against the marble kitchen island. I walked over and picked it up. It was David. I accepted the call, expecting a routine update on the emergency injunction we were filing in the morning. "Tell me the wire transfer is blocked," I said, taking a sip of the wine. "It's blocked, Maya," David said. His voice didn't carry the usual professional triumph. It sounded tight, strained with an urgency that immediately made my stomach knot. "But we found something else. Something much worse." I set the wineglass down on the marble counter. "Define worse, David." I could hear the frantic tapping of a keyboard through the receiver. "Eleanor didn't just steal the trust," David said, his breath hitching slightly. "When she filed the forgery 16 years ago, she kept your old Social Security details. We just ran a deep credit sweep on Marcus's corporate entities." A cold, creeping dread began to trace its way up my spine. "For the last 5 years," David whispered, "your mother has been actively forging your identity. She didn't just give Marcus your inheritance. She used your name to co-sign all of his massive high-interest business loans." The crisp, biting wind of late November whipped dead leaves across the circular driveway as I parked my car in front of Eleanor's sprawling suburban estate. The house was a massive faux colonial monolith, boasting perfectly manicured hedges and a grand double-door entrance. From the street, it projected an image of untouchable generational wealth. It was the exact image Eleanor had dedicated her entire life to maintaining. But as I walked up the bluestone path, my heels clicking softly against the expensive masonry, I didn't see a fortress of prosperity. I saw a house of cards. I knew exactly how heavily mortgaged the property was. I knew about the deferred maintenance she hid from her country club friends, and I knew that the mahogany front doors were paid for with money stolen from my future. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs, and rang the bell. My mother opened the door. She was draped in cream-colored cashmere, a thick string of pearls resting against her collarbone. Her smile was tight, a performative stretching of her lips, designed strictly for the benefit of any neighbors who might be watching. "Maya," Eleanor said, her eyes quickly scanning my simple, unbranded wool coat. "You actually came. Happy Thanksgiving, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly level. I stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside was suffocatingly warm, thick with the scent of roasted sage cinnamon and the unspoken tension that always hung over our family gatherings. Marcus was already in the living room, slouched in a wing-back chair with a heavy crystal tumbler of bourbon resting on his knee. He looked terrible. There were dark, bruised bags under his eyes, and his leg bounced with a frantic, jittery energy. He kept glancing at his phone, no doubt checking his accounts for a wire transfer from the family trust, a transfer that my legal team had officially frozen at 8 a.m. that morning. He wouldn't be getting a single dime, but he didn't know that yet. Chloe was perched on the edge of the velvet sofa, inspecting her manicured nails. She didn't even bother to look up when I walked in. "You're late," Chloe announced to the room at large. "We were just about to open the good wine." "Traffic was heavy," I said, taking a seat directly across from Marcus. I crossed my legs and offered him a serene, unwavering smile. He flinched quickly, looking down at his drink. The evening proceeded exactly as I had anticipated. It was an orchestrated, methodical ambush. Eleanor didn't wait until the turkey was carved to spring her trap. She ushered me into the massive marble island kitchen under the guise of helping her pour the wine. The moment the swinging door swung shut behind us, the maternal facade dropped completely. "Marcus told me about your little theatrical stunt at his office," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a harsh, commanding register. She leaned against the marble counter, crossing her arms. "I don't know who you slept with to get your hands on a company like Apex Equities, and frankly, I don't care. But we need to discuss his lease." I picked up a wine glass, admiring the way the kitchen lighting caught the crystal. "There is nothing to discuss. Marcus owes $240,000. If he doesn't pay, he gets evicted. It is standard commercial protocol." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You will waive that debt immediately. You will also extend his lease rent-free for the next 12 months while his startup finalizes its next phase. You have newfound connections, Maya. You have resources. You are going to use them to bail your brother out." "Am I?" I asked, taking a slow sip of the Cabernet. "Family protects family," Eleanor hissed, stepping closer. The scent of her expensive perfume was overwhelming. "That is how this works. You owe it to us. You owe it to your brother." I lowered my glass. I looked directly into her eyes, stripping away every ounce of the timid, desperate daughter she was used to bullying. "That is a fascinating philosophy, Eleanor," I said gently, "because I seem to recall a very different set of rules. I gently remind you that family certainly didn't protect me when I was 18, begging you for a fraction of my father's estate just to pay for my community college textbooks. You told me there was nothing left. You let me freeze." The kitchen door swung open before Eleanor could respond. Chloe marched in her heels, clicking aggressively against the tile. She had clearly been eavesdropping. "You are so unbelievably selfish," Chloe snapped, glaring at me with absolute disgust. "Marcus is trying to build a real empire. He is under an immense amount of pressure, and you are trying to ruin him just because you're still bitter about the past. You should be grateful Mom even let you in the house today after the way you threatened him." I turned my attention to my younger sister. She was so deeply embedded in Eleanor's false reality that she genuinely believed I was the villain. "I am not ruining Marcus," I said softly, looking back and forth between the two of them. "Marcus ruined himself. I am just the person holding the receipts." Eleanor let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You think you hold any power here because you own a building? You are nothing, Maya. You are a glorified property manager throwing a tantrum. Marcus has capital coming in tomorrow. He doesn't need your charity." I smiled. It was a small, terrifyingly calm smile. "Capital," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue. I set my wine glass down on the marble counter with a soft clink. "It's funny you mention capital, Eleanor, especially considering the current lending rates. I was actually looking over some standard underwriting procedures recently. Have you ever heard of a UCC-1 financing statement?" Eleanor frowned, a flicker of confusion breaking through her arrogance. "What are you talking about?" "Or a mezzanine debt structure?" I continued, my voice dropping to a quiet conversational murmur. "Specifically, a mezzanine loan restructured on October 14th of last year, a loan requiring a personal guarantor." The color drained out of Eleanor's face in a single sickening rush. Her posture went entirely rigid. "I was reading about a revolving credit line," I said, stepping just an inch closer to my mother. "One secured with a very specific piece of collateral and a social security number ending in 4219. Eleanor stopped breathing. 4219. My social security number. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The absolute paralyzing terror in her eyes was exquisite. She realized in that exact fraction of a second that I knew. She knew that I had seen the forged signatures. She knew that the entire fraudulent financial house of cards she had built to keep Marcus afloat was completely exposed. Before she could form a single word of defense, the dining room bell chimed. Dinner was served. "Let's go eat," I said pleasantly, brushing past her frozen form. The atmosphere at the grand dining table was suffocating. Marcus was sweating through his expensive dress shirt, his eyes darting to his phone every 30 seconds. Eleanor sat at the head of the table like a wax statue, her knuckles white, as she gripped her silverware, refusing to look in my direction. Only Chloe seemed entirely oblivious to the silent psychological warfare actively detonating around her. Halfway through the main course, Chloe stood up. She tapped her crystal water glass with her butter knife, the sharp, ringing sound cutting through the heavy silence. "I have an announcement." Chloe beamed, her eyes shining with manic excitement. She raised her left hand, flashing a massive, glittering diamond ring. "Julian proposed last night. We are officially engaged." Marcus let out a distracted, hollow cheer. Eleanor managed a weak, trembling smile. "Julian Hayes," I mused aloud. "The city alderman. Congratulations, Chloe. I'm sure his political career will benefit greatly from aligning with our family." "It will," Chloe said haughtily, sitting back down. She folded her hands on the table and looked directly at me. Her expression hardened into a look of absolute unyielding entitlement. "Which brings me to my next point. Since you are apparently swimming in corporate cash, Maya, you are going to pay for the wedding." I raised an eyebrow, picking up my napkin. "Excuse me." "Julian's family is prominent," Chloe stated as if explaining basic math. "We cannot have a cheap, embarrassing reception. I've already spoken to a planner. $150,000 should cover the venue and the basics. I expect you to write the check by Monday so we can secure the deposit." It wasn't a request, it was a demand. She genuinely believed that because I had money, it automatically belonged to her. I looked at Chloe, then at Marcus, and finally at Eleanor. The audacity was almost breathtaking. Eleanor leaned forward. The sheer panic I had seen in the kitchen was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered viciousness. She thought she still held the ultimate trump card. She thought her 5 years of secret fraud was a weapon she could use against me. She leaned across the table, her face inches from mine, and dropped her voice into a harsh, venomous whisper, meant only for me. "You are going to write your sister that check, Maya." Eleanor hissed, her eyes locking onto mine with ruthless intent. "You will write the check, and you will wipe your brother's corporate debt clean. Because if you don't, I will let Marcus default on every single one of those business loans currently tied to your name. I will let the bank seize your assets, I will ruin your pristine credit score, and I will destroy your entire life all over again." The heat of Eleanor's breath against my cheek was a stark contrast to the absolute ice freezing over my heart. She remained leaning over the Thanksgiving table, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany wood so tightly her knuckles were translucent. She was waiting for the terror to set in. She was waiting for the little girl she had thrown into the cold to reappear, crying and begging for mercy. The sheer absurdity of the threat almost made me laugh aloud. Eleanor genuinely believed that threatening my personal credit score would somehow cripple me. She had no concept of the corporate fortress I had built. She had no idea that my personal net worth hovered near $500 million, securely shielded behind layers of irrevocable trusts and untouchable holding companies. A defaulted loan in my name wouldn't even register as a rounding error on my accountant's daily brief. But I didn't let her see that. I needed her to feel powerful. I needed her to believe she still held the leash. I let my shoulders slump. I widened my eyes, forcing my breathing to quicken into short, shallow gasps. I looked down at my plate, letting my hands tremble visibly in my lap. You wouldn't do that," I whispered, injecting a perfect tremor of panic into my voice. "Eleanor, please. That would ruin everything I've worked for." "Try me!" Eleanor snapped, her voice triumphant. She sat back down, smoothing her cashmere sweater with a look of supreme satisfaction. $150,000 for your sister's wedding. And the back rent forgiven. That is the price of keeping your pristine little life intact. Do we have an agreement, Maya?" I kept my gaze fixed on the table, playing the role of the defeated, broken daughter to perfection. I need a few days, I stammered, my voice small and defeated. I I will look into moving some capital around. Just give me until next week. Marcus let out a loud, obnoxious bark of laughter. He grabbed his bourbon glass, raising it in a mocking toast. See, Mom, I told you she just needed a little push to remember her family values. Chloe beamed, already scrolling through her phone to look at wedding venues. Make sure the check is certified, Maya. Julian's family is expecting the deposit by Monday. I nodded silently. I excused myself before dessert was served, walking out of my childhood home with my head bowed. But the second the heavy front doors closed behind me, my posture snapped straight. The trembling stopped. I walked to my car, the cold November air acting as a perfect clarifying tonic. They had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them, the war room. At 7 a.m. the next morning, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive boardroom at Apex Equities. The Chicago skyline was obscured by heavy gray clouds, reflecting the quiet storm brewing inside the room behind me. David, my head of forensic accounting, sat at the long quartz table alongside a team of 3 senior analysts and my lead private investigator, a former federal agent named Vance. I turned away from the window and placed my hands flat on the table. Eleanor thinks she is holding a gun to my head, I said, my voice echoing coldly in the vast space. She doesn't realize I manufacture the bullets. David, I want Marcus's entire corporate debt portfolio consolidated under Apex Equities by the end of the business day. David brought up a complex financial mapping system on the room's main projector. He is heavily leveraged, Maya. His lenders are already panicked. If we approach them with a quiet off-market buyout, they will practically hand us the paper just to mitigate their losses. Do it, I commanded. We are going to systematically purchase the literal chains holding his fake empire together. I outlined the immediate directives to the team. Bam! Acquire the mezzanine debt. Purchase the high-interest short-term loans. Eleanor co-signed. Buy them out for pennies on the dollar through our anonymous subsidiary shell companies. Absorb the vendor liens. Find every unpaid contractor, software provider, and equipment leaser Marcus has stiffed over the last 6 months. Buy out their invoices. Investigate the fiancé. Vance was tasked with a deep-dive background check on Julian Hayes. A local politician marrying into Eleanor's circus was a liability waiting to happen, and I needed to know exactly what kind of man Chloe was bringing into the crossfire. By purchasing the debt, I was entirely removing the banks from the equation. When Marcus inevitably defaulted, he wouldn't be answering to faceless corporate lenders. He would be answering directly to me, the stolen seed capital. By Thursday afternoon, the trap was fully set. Apex Equities officially owned 80% of Marcus's outstanding corporate liabilities. We were his landlord, his primary creditor, and his executioner. But as the financial data continued to pour in, David discovered something that pushed the situation from gross incompetence into pure criminality. I was sitting at my desk reviewing Vance's preliminary report on Julian Hayes when David burst into my office. He didn't knock. He dropped a thick, red-flagged audit report directly onto my keyboard. You need to look at the offshore routing, Maya, David said, his usually calm demeanor replaced by tight, nervous energy. Marcus isn't just failing to generate revenue. He's actively bleeding the company dry. I opened the file. The ledger showed a series of complex, layered transactions moving from the startup's primary operational account through 3 different dummy corporations registered in Delaware. From there, the money was wired directly to offshore accounts in Macau and the Cayman Islands. Gambling, I whispered, recognizing the routing numbers from previous corporate acquisitions involving illicit debt. Massive gambling, David confirmed grimly. He is siphoning his initial seed capital to cover personal losses at underground tables. He is embezzling millions of dollars from his own investors. A sickening knot formed in my stomach. Marcus had stolen my father's legacy, drained the hidden trust, and when that wasn't enough, he began stealing from the very people keeping his fake company afloat. He wasn't just facing bankruptcy anymore. He was looking at a decade in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. Have the initial investors noticed the capital burn? I asked, scanning the terrifying rate of the withdrawals. Not yet, David replied. He's been cooking the quarterly reports to hide the liquidity crisis, but he is entirely out of cash. If he doesn't secure a massive cash injection in the next 2 weeks, the entire operation collapses, and the SEC will be crawling all over his books. The final lifeline. I sent David back to his team to compile the embezzlement evidence into an airtight, undeniable dossier. I sat in the silence of my office, the weight of the impending destruction settling over me. I was holding the detonator to my family's entire existence. At 11:30 p.m., the private line on my desk phone rang. It was a direct line known only to my inner circle of senior partners and a select few peers in the venture capital industry. I picked up the receiver. "Maya," a familiar, exhausted voice said through the speaker. It was Liam Vance. Liam was a brilliant, aggressive venture capitalist running a boutique equity firm out of Silicon Valley. 5 years ago, I had mentored him through his first major hostile takeover. We maintained a deep, unspoken professional respect. "Liam," I said, leaning back in my chair. "It's late in Chicago. What do you need?" "I need a reality check." Liam sighed, the sound of ice clinking in a glass echoing over the line. "I'm the lead angel investor on a tech startup based in your city. It's been bleeding cash, and the CEO is dodging my request for a full forensic audit. I just ran a deep background check on him, and I noticed something that made me pull my punches." "And what was that?" I asked, my pulse suddenly spiking. "His last name," Liam said quietly. "Marcus Wilson. Maya is this guy, your brother." I closed my eyes. The universe was wrapping the final cord around Marcus's neck and handing me the ends. "Unfortunately, yes," I replied, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "Why are you calling me Liam?" "Because Marcus just sent out invitations to an exclusive black tie investor gala this coming Saturday." Liam revealed, his tone shifting into predatory alertness. "He's renting out the grand atrium at the museum. He is pitching a Series B funding round, begging for a $10 million lifeline to keep his company afloat." Liam paused, waiting for my reaction. When I didn't speak, he continued. "He's leveraging his family name, Maya," Liam warned softly. "He's telling everyone in the valley that the Wilson family wealth is backing the venture. I called you as a courtesy before I pull my funding and let him drown." I opened my eyes, staring at the illuminated Chicago skyline outside my window. "Don't pull your funding yet, Liam," I said, a dangerous razor-sharp smile spreading across my face. "Keep your RSVP active. In fact, I want you to attend." "Maya, the guy is a liability. Why would I attend a sinking ship's gala?" "Because," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, "you are going to send me a +1 invitation. I am going to attend my brother's gala, and I am going to sink the ship myself." The brisk, biting wind of early December whipped off Lake Michigan as I pulled my car into the circular driveway of Eleanor's suburban estate on Tuesday morning. I had spent the last 48 hours letting Eleanor and Marcus marinate in their perceived victory, and now it was time to play my part. Before stepping out of the car, I adjusted my posture. I let my shoulders roll forward a fraction, kept my gaze slightly lowered, and gripped my leather folio tightly against my chest like a shield. I needed to look like a woman who had been thoroughly broken by her mother's blackmail. Eleanor was waiting in the sunroom, perched in a high-backed chair like a monarch receiving a defeated rebel. Marcus was sprawled across the white linen sofa, tapping away on his phone, while Chloe casually flipped through a glossy bridal magazine. The air in the room was thick with a suffocating, insufferable smugness. "Well," Eleanor asked, not bothering to offer me a seat, She took a slow, deliberate sip from her porcelain teacup. I assume you've had time to review your options. I have, I said, pitching my voice to sound slightly breathless, executing a perfect imitation of quiet panic. I spoke with my bank. I can facilitate the funds for Chloe's wedding deposit, and I can initiate the restructuring of Marcus's debt. Marcus let out a sharp, derisive bark of laughter. He tossed his phone onto the glass coffee table and leaned back, lacing his hands behind his head. I told you, Mom. She just needed a weekend to realize who holds the cards. Good girl, Maya. I knew you'd eventually learn how to play ball. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away from his arrogant sneer. There is a logistical issue, however. Because of the sheer volume of the debt transfer, my underwriting department requires standard compliance documentation. They need a verified view of your corporate ledger, Marcus. Just a read-only access link to process the debt forgiveness on our end. Marcus rolled his eyes, letting out an exaggerated groan. Jesus, you property management people love your red tape. It's a simple debt transfer, Maya. Don't make it harder than it has to be. I don't have a choice, I stammered, gripping my folio tighter. If you want the capital cleared by Friday, the bank needs the raw data files today. It's just a formality to appease the auditors. Marcus looked at Eleanor, who gave him a dismissive nod. In their minds, I was nothing more than an intimidated, glorified landlord, terrified of having my personal credit ruined. The idea that I might actually possess the financial literacy to weaponize his data didn't even cross their minds. Marcus pulled his laptop from his messenger bag, typed for less than a minute, and hit enter. I just emailed you a secure token, he said, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. Full administrative read access to the back-end ledgers. Tell your bean counters to hurry up. I have a company to run. Thank you, I whispered. I turned and walked out of the house, keeping my head bowed until the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me. The second my hand touched the steering wheel of my car, the trembling victim vanished. I pulled out my phone and forwarded the access token directly to David at Apex Equities. By the time I reached my downtown headquarters, my forensic accounting team had already breached the ledger. The war room was a hive of quiet, lethal efficiency. Monitors glowed with lines of code, transaction histories, and complex routing maps. He handed us the keys to the castle, David said, shaking his head in sheer disbelief as I walked in. He pointed to the primary projection screen. Marcus didn't just give us the operational accounts. He gave us the shadow ledgers. The arrogance is staggering. Walk me through it, I commanded, taking off my coat and stepping up to the glass table. David brought up a series of highlighted wire transfers. It took us less than 48 hours to trace the entire web. Marcus has been actively drawing down the multi-million-dollar seed capital provided by his angel investors. He routes it through a vendor payment system, logs it as software development costs, and then funnels it into 3 offshore accounts. From there, it goes straight to the casinos in Macau. He has embezzled $4.2 million in the last 8 months alone. I stared at the numbers. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. It wasn't just corporate negligence. It was a brazen, systematic plundering of his own investors. The best part, Vance, my lead investigator, chimed in from the corner. I ran the background check on Chloe's new fiancé, Julian Hayes. Our city alderman likes to project an image of a squeaky clean public servant. But his campaign finances are currently under quiet review by the Ethics Board. He is desperate for an injection of untraceable wealth to cover his own missing campaign funds. He isn't marrying Chloe for love, Maya. He is marrying her because Eleanor convinced him the Wilson family has millions in liquid capital ready to deploy. I let out a slow, dark laugh. They were all parasites feeding off an illusion, completely unaware that the host was already dead. Lock down the files, I told David. Export every single transaction, every forged invoice, every offshore wire. Build the final dossier. I want it ready for Saturday night. My phone buzzed against the table. It was a text from Eleanor demanding my presence at the Grand Atrium Museum the following morning for a logistics walkthrough. When I arrived at the museum the next day, the vast marble-floored hall was crawling with event planners, florists, and lighting technicians. The ceiling arched 50 feet overhead, draped in cascading silk, and thousands of imported white orchids. It was a grotesque display of opulence. Eleanor was standing near the center of the room, barking orders at a terrified caterer. She spotted me and gestured sharply for me to approach. Chloe was standing beside her, typing furiously on her phone, entirely absorbed in her own self-importance. "I'm combining the events," Eleanor announced the second I was within earshot. She didn't offer a greeting. "Marcus's investor gala needs to project absolute stability to the Silicon Valley executives flying in. What better way to demonstrate generational wealth and family unity than by hosting Chloe's engagement party in the exact same room? It shows the venture capitalists that our family is prosperous, expanding, and heavily connected to city politics." "It's a brilliant strategy, Mother," I said smoothly, looking around at the thousands of dollars of floral arrangements that I was supposedly paying for. "It projects exactly the right image." "Julian's entire family will be here," Chloe chimed in, finally looking up from her phone. "So you need to make sure everything is flawless, Maya. I won't tolerate any embarrassing hiccups." I frowned, slightly tilting my head. "Make sure everything is flawless. I thought you hired a coordinator." Eleanor turned to me, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, wanting to ensure I felt the full weight of her authority. She was determined to remind me that despite the money she was extorting from me, I was still the unwanted, disposable daughter. "You aren't attending this gala as a guest, Maya," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "You do not belong at a table with Julian's family or Marcus's investors. You lack the grace and the pedigree for high society." She reached out, adjusting the lapel of my coat with a condescending pat. "Since your money is funding this little endeavor, I expect you to make yourself useful." Eleanor continued, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "You will be stationed in the back corridors. You will manage the catering staff, you will oversee the kitchen timelines, and you will work the coat check when the VIPs arrive. It is time you remembered your proper place in this family before we take your check." I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand, echoing atrium. The sheer audacity of her demand, expecting the CEO of Apex Equities to fetch coats for her fraudulent son's investors, was the final perfect stroke of irony. I looked at Eleanor's triumphant, arrogant face. I thought about the meticulously organized criminal dossier sitting on my desk and the venture capitalist friends of mine who were currently flying first class to Chicago, preparing to watch this ship sink. I let a slow, warm, accommodating smile spread across my face. "Of course, Eleanor," I said, my voice dripping with absolute sincerity. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The Grand Atrium Museum had been transformed into a monument to Eleanor's vanity. By 7 o'clock on Saturday evening, a fleet of black luxury vehicles clogged the circular drive, depositing Chicago's elite into the biting winter air. Inside, thousands of white orchids cascaded from the vaulted glass ceiling, catching the soft amber glow of the suspended chandeliers. A string quartet played in the corner, their music completely drowned out by the echoing chatter of venture capitalists, politicians, and high society socialites. I was standing precisely where my mother had ordered me to be, tucked away in the shadows of the marble coat check. Eleanor had demanded I wear plain black. I had complied, choosing a tailored, high-necked wool dress that fell past my knees. With my hair pulled back into a severe knot, I looked exactly like the rest of the hired help. "Don't just stand there, Maya," Eleanor hissed, appearing suddenly at my elbow. She was wrapped in emerald silk diamonds dripping from her ears. "The alderman's parents just arrived. Take their coats. And for God's sake, go into the kitchen and tell the catering manager that the hors d'oeuvres are circulating too slowly. We have billionaires in this room." "Right away, Eleanor," I said, my tone incredibly mild. I took a heavy mink coat from an older woman who didn't even bother to look at my face. I hung it up with practiced efficiency. I wasn't angry. I wasn't humiliated. The indignity of fetching coats for my family's guests didn't burn. It was a cold, necessary anesthetic. Every snapped order, every dismissive wave of Eleanor's hand only sharpened the edge of the blade I was preparing to drop. I moved silently out of the cloakroom and navigated the narrow, bustling corridor leading to the catering kitchen. The staff was overwhelmed, frantic under the pressure of Eleanor's impossible demands. I quietly organized the traffic flow, directing the servers toward the areas of the atrium where the highest concentration of venture capitalists were gathered. "They need more champagne near the East exhibit," the catering manager panted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But I don't have enough hands." "I'll take it," I said, lifting a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal flutes. I pushed through the swinging doors and stepped out into the glittering chaos of the gala. The contrast was almost intoxicating. I was the wealthiest person in the building, holding the financial execution orders for the entire family in my back pocket, yet I was effortlessly blending into the background as a servant. I navigated the crowd, offering champagne to men in bespoke tuxedos who took the glasses without a second glance. I saw Chloe holding court near a towering ice sculpture, her arm looped tightly through Julian's. The city alderman looked polished, but there was a distinct tightness around his eyes, the nervous, calculating look of a politician desperately hoping this family's supposed wealth would cover his impending campaign finance scandals. Across the room, Marcus was in his element. He was surrounded by a circle of older, wealthy investors, laughing loudly and gesturing with a supreme, unearned confidence. He was playing the part of the visionary tech founder to absolute perfection, entirely ignorant of the fact that every single lie he told was currently being cataloged by my forensic team. I continued moving through the atrium, the silver tray balanced effortlessly on my fingertips. As I approached the East exhibit, a group of 3 men standing near a marble pillar caught my eye. It was Liam Vance. He was flanked by 2 other heavy-hitting venture capitalists from Silicon Valley, men I had negotiated fiercely with over multi-million-dollar acquisitions just months prior. Liam was mid-sentence, swirling the amber liquid in his glass when he turned his head and saw me. His voice abruptly died in his throat. Liam's eyes widened. He blinked, staring at my plain black dress, the tray of champagne in my hands, and the complete lack of security or entourage around me. He knew I was the billionaire CEO of Apex Equities. He knew I commanded a firm that routinely swallowed companies 10 times the size of Marcus's pathetic startup. Seeing me carrying drinks like a common waitress sent his brain into a visible short circuit. Liam's mouth parted. He took a half step forward, his brow furrowing in profound confusion, about to call out my name. I didn't break my stride. I looked directly into his eyes and gave the most infinitesimal, commanding shake of my head. Liam froze. He was a predator in the financial world, a man who understood the subtle, deadly language of boardrooms and hostile takeovers. He saw the cold, dead calm in my eyes. He saw the trap. He snapped his mouth shut smoothly, masking his shock with a cough, and stepped back. He nudged one of his colleagues, nodding discreetly in my direction. I watched as the other 2 investors recognized me, their expressions mirroring Liam's silent, stunned bewilderment. I offered them a pleasant, empty smile, holding out the tray. Liam took a glass with a slightly trembling hand. "Enjoy the evening, gentlemen," I murmured. Before Liam could utter a single syllable, the lights in the grand atrium dimmed. A brilliant, harsh spotlight cut through the shadows, illuminating the sweeping marble staircase at the far end of the hall. The string quartet stopped playing. A hush fell over the crowd as Marcus bounded up the first few steps, a sleek microphone clipped to his lapel. Eleanor stood at the base of the stairs, her hands clasped to her chest, her eyes shimmering with manufactured maternal tears. Chloe and Julian moved to the front of the crowd, making sure the society photographers caught their perfect, adoring angles. I remained standing near the back, the silver tray resting lightly against my hip. "Welcome, everyone!" Marcus's voice boomed through the high-end sound system echoing off the glass ceiling. "Thank you all for being here tonight. When I started this company, I had a vision. But a vision is nothing without the support of the people who believe in you." He gestured grandly toward Eleanor. "My family has always been my rock. Their legacy, their unwavering belief in my potential has brought me to this moment." I watched him lie with the effortless ease of a sociopath. He was standing on a stage paid for by money he stole from his investors, leveraging a family legacy funded entirely by the trust fund my father left for me. Building a tech empire is not for the faint of heart. Marcus continued pacing the marble steps with practiced charisma. "There are long nights. There are moments of doubt. There are financial hurdles that test your resolve. But true innovation attracts the right kind of attention." He paused, letting the suspense build. He looked out over the sea of faces, his chest puffing out with absolute undeniable triumph. "Tonight," Marcus announced, his voice ringing with pure arrogance, "I am thrilled to share that we have officially closed our Series B funding. Not only have we secured a $10 million capital injection to propel our software into the global market, but our new partner has also graciously agreed to restructure and consolidate all of our outstanding operational debt." The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Eleanor wiped a delicate tear from her cheek. Chloe beamed, kissing Julian's cheek. Marcus raised his hands, silencing the applause so he could deliver his final crowning achievement. "It takes a visionary firm to recognize a visionary product," Marcus declared, flashing a brilliant, blinding smile. "Please raise your glasses to our new primary stakeholders, the titans of corporate restructuring who believed in my future. Apex Equities." The applause swelled again. Glasses were raised. Cheers echoed through the cavernous museum. I stood perfectly still in the shadows. I watched my mother weep with joy. I watched my brother bask in the glory of his ultimate salvation. I listened to him proudly scream the name of the company that was about to liquidate his entire existence. I took a slow sip from a glass of champagne on my tray. It tasted absolutely perfect. The applause thundered around me, a sickening wave of unearned adulation washing over the palatial country club atrium. Marcus stood center stage, arms raised in a victorious V, soaking in the admiration of the venture capitalists, the local politicians, and the high society elite. He was a fraud, wrapped in a tailored tuxedo, basking in the glow of a salvation he hadn't earned. I lowered my champagne flute onto the silver tray I was carrying. A passing waiter hurried by, his brow slick with sweat from Eleanor's relentless demands. I gently placed the tray into his hands. He blinked in confusion, but before he could speak, I reached behind my waist. With a swift, fluid motion, I untied the black catering apron Eleanor had forced me to wear. I let the fabric slip from my fingers, pooling on the polished marble floor like a discarded shadow. The heavy, tailored wool of my high-necked black dress suddenly felt less like a servant's uniform and more like armor. It was time. I stepped out from the darkened alcove of the coat check and into the brilliant, cascading light of the chandeliers. The crowd was still clapping, murmuring excitedly to one another about the legendary Apex Equities, the faceless corporate leviathan that had just seemingly blessed Marcus with a golden touch. I walked with a slow, measured cadence up the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the stone. Eleanor saw me first. She was stationed at the base of the grand staircase, a lace handkerchief pressed delicately to her cheek as she performed the role of the weeping, proud matriarch. As her eyes locked onto my advancing figure, the manufactured joy vanished, replaced instantly by a visceral, ugly fury. She lunged forward, stepping directly into my path, her manicured fingers digging viciously into the wool of my sleeve. "What do you think you are doing?" She hissed, her voice a toxic, frantic whisper meant only for my ears. "Get back to the kitchen immediately before you ruin everything." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I stopped and looked down at her hand, and then slowly brought my gaze up to meet hers. For 32 years, she had relied on my compliance, my desperate need for her approval, and my fear of her wrath. I let every ounce of that fear evaporate, letting the cold, ruthless apex predator she had unknowingly created rise to the surface. "Let go of me, Eleanor," I said. My voice was so devoid of emotion, so chillingly flat, that she instinctively recoiled. Her hand dropped to her side as if she had been burned. Her mouth parted in silent shock, but I was already moving past her, ascending the sweeping marble stairs. Marcus caught sight of me as I reached the landing. A flicker of intense annoyance crossed his features, but with the flashbulbs of society photographers going off, he quickly masked it with a wide, patronizing grin. He assumed I was coming up to hug him, to play the pathetic, supportive sister, eager to bask in the crumbs of his spotlight. "And here is my sister Maya," Marcus announced into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. He reached out, wrapping a heavy, suffocating arm around my shoulders. "Always supporting me behind the scenes. Come to give your big brother a hug, Maya." I didn't lean into his embrace. Instead, with a smooth, practiced motion, I reached up and slipped the microphone directly out of his fingers. Marcus frowned, his arm dropping to his side. "Maya, what are you—" "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice booming through the high-end sound system, slicing effortlessly through the remaining murmurs of the crowd. The room fell into a sudden, expectant silence. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. I looked out over the sea of Chicago's elite, the glittering diamonds, the bespoke suits, and the calculating faces of the venture capitalists I had manipulated into attending this farce. "My brother is absolutely right." I continued, my tone perfectly, even projecting absolute professional authority. "Building an empire is not for the faint of heart. It requires vision, ruthless execution, and above all, enormous capital." I turned my head slightly, finding Liam Vance in the front row. The brilliant Silicon Valley investor was watching me with a rapt, predatory stillness. A knowing, dangerous smirk was slowly spreading across his lips. He finally understood the game. "Marcus introduced me to you as his sister," I said, my gaze sweeping back over the expansive atrium. "And while that is a biological reality, it is not my professional title. For those of you I haven't yet had the pleasure of destroying in a boardroom, allow me to properly introduce myself." I let the silence stretch, holding the entire room in the palm of my hand. "My name is Maya Wilson. I am the sole founder, primary shareholder, and chief executive officer of Apex Equities." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the room. It started in the front rows where the heavy-hitting executive stood and rolled backward like a seismic shockwave. Liam Vance raised his champagne flute toward me in a silent, deeply respectful salute. Frantic, urgent whispers erupted across the floor as the elite investors realized the woman who had been quietly serving them drinks and checking their coats was the billionaire titan they had been desperately hoping to court all evening. I turned my head to look at my family. Marcus was staring at me, his jaw slack, his eyes bulging. All the color had drained from his face until his skin matched the white orchids cascading from the ceiling. His mind was violently short-circuiting, desperately trying to reconcile the subservient sister he had bullied his whole life with the corporate executioner standing before him. At the base of the stairs, Eleanor looked as though she had been physically struck. She was gripping the marble banister so hard her knuckles were translucent. She was shaking her mouth, opening and closing without sound. The absolute illusion of control she had clung to for decades was shattering into dust right in front of her eyes. Chloe and Julian were frozen near the ice sculpture. Julian's polished political smile had completely vanished. As a man running for office, he understood optics better than anyone. I watched the dawning, terrifying comprehension wash over his face. He realized in real time that the family he was marrying into wasn't backing Marcus's venture. He realized that the sister Chloe, treated like a servant, owned the venture. I watched as Julian slowly, deliberately slid his arm out of Chloe's grip, stepping an inch away from her. I turned my body fully toward Marcus. He took a staggering step back, his hands trembling visibly at his sides. The arrogant bravado was entirely gone. In its place was the pure, unadulterated terror of a boy who realized the monster in the dark was real, and it had just locked the door. Apex Equities is indeed an aggressive firm, I continued, my voice echoing like a gavel striking a block. We specialize in corporate restructuring, debt consolidation, and hostile acquisitions. When my team brought Marcus's startup to my attention, we initiated our standard, rigorous due diligence process to facilitate the $10 million capital injection he so proudly just announced. The silence in the room was absolute. The string quartet had long since lowered their bows. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. We required full administrative access to your corporate ledgers, Marcus. I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal, undeniable weight of an executioner. Not just your operational accounts, your shadow ledgers. We traced the offshore routing to Macau. We verified the falsified vendor invoices. We mapped exactly how you have been siphoning millions from your own seed investors to cover your underground gambling debts. A collective murmur of shock and outrage swept through the crowd. Investors began pulling out their phones. As CEO of Apex Equities, I announced, raising the microphone slightly, my eyes locked dead on my brother's terrified, pale face. I am standing before your investors tonight to officially announce that we are withdrawing our funding offer effectively immediately. We do not invest in companies built on embezzlement, and we certainly do not fund undeniable federal wire fraud. The silence in the grand atrium lasted exactly 3 seconds. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum, the kind that precedes a catastrophic detonation. Then the illusion shattered. The ensuing chaos was a symphony of panic. A collective, chaotic roar erupted from the polished crowd. The polite murmurs of high society vanished, replaced by the frantic, echoing shouts of venture capitalists barking orders into their phones. Men in bespoke tuxedos abandoned their champagne flutes on whatever flat surface they could find, their faces pale with the sudden realization that their investments were evaporating in real time. Several executives didn't even bother to make calls. They simply turned on their heels and sprinted for the museum's heavy glass exit doors, desperate to distance their firms from the blast radius of a federal scandal. Marcus stood frozen in the center of the stage. The arrogant, visionary posture he had held moments before had collapsed entirely. He shrank in on himself, his knees buckling slightly, so that he had to grip the acrylic podium just to remain upright. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the glare of the spotlight. He opened his mouth, stammering incoherently into the dead microphone I had taken from him, but no sound came out. "You little bitch!" The screech tore through the ambient noise of the ballroom like tearing metal. Eleanor charged up the sweeping marble stairs. She had completely abandoned the regal, weeping matriarch persona. Her emerald silk dress whipped around her legs as she scrambled onto the stage, her face flushed an ugly mottled crimson, her eyes wide and feral. She lunged at me, her manicured claws extended, desperately trying to snatch the microphone from my hand. I simply took a half step back, my movements fluid and unhurried. Her momentum carried her forward, and she stumbled awkwardly, her high heel catching on the edge of a stage monitor. She caught herself on Marcus's shoulder, her chest heaving. "Do not listen to her!" Eleanor screamed at the crowd, her voice cracking with hysterical desperation. She waved her arms frantically at the fleeing investors. "She is lying. She is a miserable, vindictive liar. She has always been jealous of Marcus. She's a failure who couldn't stand to see her brother succeed, so she's making up these insane stories to ruin his big night security. Get her out of here." Nobody moved to help her. The elite crowd merely paused their frantic phone calls to stare at her. Eleanor looked entirely unhinged, a shrieking woman in diamonds defending a sinking ship. The contrast between her frantic heat and my absolute freezing calm was undeniable. They were looking at a billionaire CEO executing a hostile teardown, and they knew exactly who to believe. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored wool dress and retrieved a small silver flash drive. The polished metal caught the spotlight gleaming like a razor blade. I stepped up to the very edge of the stage and looked down into the front row. "Liam," I said, projecting my voice clearly without needing the microphone. Liam Vance stepped forward, separating himself from the panicked herd of venture capitalists. His face was a mask of grim professional fury. He walked right up to the base of the stage, looking up at me with a mixture of profound respect and simmering anger at having been duped by the Wilson family. "As the lead seed investor in this fraudulent enterprise," I said, my tone strictly business, "you have a fiduciary duty to your partners to review this immediately. It contains the complete unredacted data pull from Marcus's shadow ledgers. You will find irrefutable proof of massive embezzlement, falsified quarterly revenue reports, and offshore wire transfers, routing your seed capital directly to high-stakes gambling syndicates in Macau." I crouched down slightly and placed the silver flash drive directly into Liam's outstretched palm. His fingers closed tightly around it. Furthermore, I continued standing back up and addressing the remaining crowd. "The drive contains evidence of identity theft. Marcus forged the signatures of 2 imaginary board members to secure his initial line of credit, utilizing the social security numbers of deceased former employees. Apex Equities will be handing our parallel findings over to the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the FBI, first thing Monday morning." Marcus let out a strangled, pathetic whimper. He sank entirely to the floor of the stage, pulling his knees to his chest, burying his face in his hands. The mention of the FBI had finally broken whatever fragile delusion he was clinging to. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders, but her eyes were fixed on me. They were wide with a terror so pure and absolute it was almost blinding. She finally understood that I hadn't just refused to pay her blackmail. I had meticulously dismantled the very foundation of her existence. "You ruined us," she whispered the words, barely carrying over the edge of the stage. "You ruined your own family." "You ruined yourselves, Eleanor," I replied softly, ensuring the microphone was lowered so only she could hear. "I just turned on the lights." Down on the main floor, the reality of the situation was hitting the final remaining players. Julian Hayes stood near the melting ice sculpture, staring at the stage. The slick, handsome city alderman looked as though he had seen a ghost. His political career was built on the perception of integrity and elite connections. He had attached himself to Chloe entirely under the assumption that the Wilson family possessed untouchable generational wealth that could quietly plug the holes in his own campaign finances. Now he was standing in a room full of furious billionaires, watching his future brother-in-law face imminent federal prison time for wire fraud. Julian was a politician above all else. His survival instincts were instantaneous and entirely ruthless. It took him less than 5 seconds to calculate the catastrophic damage Chloe's family would inflict on his upcoming election cycle. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer a comforting touch. Julian simply looked down at his left hand. With cold, mechanical precision, he slid off the heavy platinum engagement band Chloe had insisted they both wear. Chloe, who had been standing frozen beside him, finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She reached out her fingers, trembling, trying to grab his sleeve. "Julian," she gasped, her voice thin and reedy. "Julian, wait. We can fix this. My mother has money, we can—" Julian didn't even look at her. He placed the platinum ring flat on the surface of a glass cocktail table. The metallic clink resonated with devastating finality. He gave me a brief, calculating nod of self-preservation, turned on his heel, and walked briskly toward the museum exits, disappearing into the cold Chicago night without a single backward glance. Chloe stared at the ring sitting abandoned on the glass table. Her breath hitched. She looked at the empty space where her fiancé had just been standing. She looked at the scattering crowd of elite guests, who were now actively avoiding making eye contact with her. She looked at the 50-foot vaulted ceiling, the cascading white orchids, the towering ice sculptures, all the opulent, ridiculous trappings of a dream wedding that was now completely irrevocably dead. There would be no high society marriage. There would be no sprawling estate funded by Marcus's fake tech empire. There would be no socialite status. There was only impending bankruptcy, public disgrace, and the absolute humiliation of being discarded in front of the very people she had spent her life trying to impress. Chloe's head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto me standing calmly at the edge of the stage. The carefully curated, polished veneer of the pampered golden sister violently peeled away, revealing something entirely feral underneath. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You!" Chloe shrieked. It was a guttural, terrifying sound, a scream of pure rage that tore through the remaining ambient noise of the atrium. She didn't walk toward the stairs. She launched herself forward, scrambling onto the edge of the stage with a terrifying, manic energy. She abandoned all grace, her silk dress tearing at the seam as she pulled herself up over the monitors. "I'll kill you!" Chloe screamed, her hands curling into fists as she physically lunged at me across the stage. Chloe never even made it past the stage monitors. Before her torn silk dress could clear the edge of the platform, two of my private security contractor's men who had been standing invisibly at the perimeter of the atrium all evening materialized like phantoms. One caught her mid-lunge, wrapping a thick, immovable arm around her waist, while the other secured her flailing arms. Chloe let out an ear-piercing shriek, thrashing wildly, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face as her designer heels kicked uselessly at the air. I didn't take a single step backward. I simply stood there looking down at my sister as she was wrestled onto the polished marble floor. Her frantic, guttural screams echoed off the vaulted glass ceilings, a stark, humiliating contrast to the refined classical music that had been playing just an hour prior. "Get her off me!" Chloe sobbed, spitting out vicious, breathless curses as the guards smoothly and professionally hauled her toward the service exit. "He left me! You made him leave me!" The heavy oak doors swung shut, cutting off her hysterics. The grand atrium was now virtually empty, save for a few straggling caterers staring in stunned silence, and my mother and brother, who were still crumpled on the floor of the stage. The elite crowd had completely evaporated, fleeing the toxic fallout of my family's exposed criminality. I stepped down from the stage, leaving Marcus sobbing into his hands, and Eleanor rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. I didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. The aftermath of the gala was swift, brutal, and entirely relentless. Within 48 hours, the fragile house of cards Marcus had built completely collapsed. Apex Equities legally triggered the default clauses hidden deep within his initial seed funding contracts. Clauses I had personally ensured were airtight. By Tuesday morning, his startup was formally placed into receivership. His corporate accounts were frozen, the sleek downtown office space was padlocked, and his employees were locked out of the servers. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. The flash drive I had handed to Liam Vance acted exactly as the detonator I knew it would be. Enraged by the deception, the Silicon Valley investors immediately turned the unredacted shadow ledgers over to the authorities. By Thursday, federal agents were executing a search warrant on my family's estate, seizing hard drives, physical files, and banking tokens. The society pages and local news networks had a field day. The headlines were merciless, painting the Wilson family not as visionary entrepreneurs, but as desperate high society grifters. Julian Hayes, exercising his flawless political survival instincts, issued a sterile, professionally drafted press release stating he was deeply disturbed by the allegations and confirming his engagement to Chloe was permanently dissolved. He scrubbed every trace of her from his social media within an hour. I watched it all unfold from the quiet, serene isolation of my penthouse suite at the Langham. High above the Chicago River, I sat in a plush armchair, sipping black coffee, coordinating the liquidation of Marcus's remaining assets with my legal team. The panoramic windows offered a sprawling view of the city, a city my family had tried to conquer through lies and one I now effectively owned through sheer undeniable leverage. It was exactly 1 week after the gala when the concierge called up to the penthouse. "Ms. Wilson," the polite voice crackled over the intercom. "There is an Eleanor Wilson in the lobby. She is highly distressed. She claims she needs to speak with you. My security team is prepared to escort her off the premises if you prefer." I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking out at the gray, overcast sky. "Send her up," I replied, "but have security wait in the hallway outside my door." 5 minutes later, a heavy knock echoed through the suite. I opened the door to find my mother standing in the corridor. The transformation was staggering. The imperious diamond-draped matriarch who had hissed at me in the cloakroom was completely gone. Eleanor looked as though she had aged 10 years in 7 days. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back into a messy clip. She wore no makeup, revealing the deep, dark bags under her eyes and the harsh, panicked lines framing her mouth. She was wearing a simple, wrinkled trench coat, a garment she would have previously burned before being seen in public wearing. "Maya," she breathed, her voice trembling. She took a step forward, her arms rising as if to pull me into a hug. I didn't move. I simply looked at her, my expression completely impassive. Her arms fell awkwardly to her sides as she stepped into the entryway of the penthouse. "Please," Eleanor sobbed, immediately crumbling. The tears began to flow thick and frantic. "Please, Maya, you have to stop this. You have to call off your lawyers. The FBI, they're talking about seizing the house. They're talking about indicting Marcus by the end of the month. He wouldn't survive in prison, Maya. You know he wouldn't." I closed the door, sealing us inside the quiet suite. "Marcus committed federal wire fraud and identity theft, Eleanor. I didn't force him to siphon millions to Macau. I merely handed the evidence to the people he stole from. It is entirely out of my hands." "It is your company," she wailed, clutching at the fabric of her coat. "You are a billionaire. You could pay them back. You could make them drop the charges." "I don't reward embezzlement," I stated flatly. Eleanor dropped to her knees right there on the hardwood floor of the entryway. It was the ultimate desperate performance. She clasped her hands together, looking up at me through a veil of manufactured agony. She was pulling out the heaviest artillery she had, the emotional manipulation she had weaponized my entire childhood. "I am your mother," she wept, her voice cracking with theatrical devastation. "I carried you for 9 months. I gave you life. I fed you. I clothed you. I raised you. You owe me, Maya. You owe me this. How can you do this to your own flesh and blood? Where is your heart?" I stared down at her. The toxicity of her words washed over me, but they found no purchase. The terrified, desperate daughter, who would have once moved mountains to wipe away her mother's tears, had died years ago, starved to death, by the very woman crying on my floor. "If you won't clear his name," Eleanor pleaded, her tone shifting rapidly from guilt-inducing sorrow to frantic bargaining, "then give us the money to leave, $5 million. That's all I'm asking. A measly $5 million. It is pocket change to a woman like you. Just give us enough to quietly leave the country before the indictments come down. Let us start over. You'll never have to see us again." I looked at the woman who had kicked me out into the street with nothing but a trash bag of clothes. I looked at the woman who had watched me carry her guests' coats and demanded I move faster. "You want me to hand you $5 million?" I said, my voice dangerously calm, "so you can flee federal prosecution using the very wealth you spent the last decade mocking me for trying to build." "You owe me!" Eleanor screamed, the desperate facade fracturing. "I am your mother." "You were my warden," I corrected softly. "And I am not giving you a single dime." The silence in the penthouse stretched tight like a wire about to snap. Eleanor remained on her knees for a long, agonizing moment, and then the tears simply vanished. The weeping, broken mother evaporated in the blink of an eye. The muscles in her face tightened, smoothing out into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She slowly pushed herself up off the floor, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with an ancient, venomous fury. "You think you're so brilliant?" she spat, her voice dropping into a vicious, guttural snarl. "You think you've won? You think your father would be so proud of the ruthless little monster you became?" I didn't react, holding my ground as she stepped inches from my face. "He knew." Eleanor hissed, a sick, victorious sneer twisting her lips. "Your father knew exactly what Marcus was. He knew his son was weak. He knew Marcus couldn't handle the pressure of the family legacy." She leaned in, her breath hot against my cheek as she delivered the final devastating blow. "That's why I had to get rid of you," she whispered, her eyes wide and manic. "Your father met with the estate lawyers 2 weeks before his heart attack. He was restructuring the entire trust. He was going to cut Marcus out entirely and leave the entire estate, the properties, the liquid assets, everything to you, because he said you were the only one with the spine to protect it." Eleanor let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "I couldn't stand it. I couldn't watch him hand my golden boy's birthright to you. So the moment your father's heart stopped beating, I destroyed the drafts and I threw you out into the street to make sure you never found out." The echo of Eleanor's venomous confession hung in the dead air of the penthouse. She stood there, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a manic, triumphant fire, expecting her words to finally break me. She expected me to crumble, to weep for the father I had misunderstood, to shatter under the weight of her ultimate betrayal. Instead, a profound glacial clarity washed over my entire being. For 32 years, a tiny, bruised fragment of my soul had wondered what was fundamentally wrong with me. Why wasn't I enough? Why was Marcus the chosen one? In a single hate-fueled breath, Eleanor had given me the greatest gift imaginable. She had completely absolved me. I wasn't the failure. I was the true heir. My father had seen my brilliance, my resilience, and my potential. Eleanor had simply stolen my birthright to crown a court jester. The last microscopic thread of familial attachment, the final ghost of the desperate daughter seeking her mother's love, quietly dissolved into nothingness. "You didn't protect his legacy, Eleanor," I said, my voice so chillingly calm that her triumphant sneer faltered. "You just delayed its rightful owner." Before she could draw a breath to scream, I stepped back and smoothly closed the heavy oak door directly in her face. The lock clicked with a resonant, absolute finality. A second later, the muffled sound of her fists pounding against the thick wood began, accompanied by incoherent, hysterical shrieks. I didn't even turn around. I simply walked over to the intercom panel and pressed the button for the concierge. "The guest in the hallway is trespassing," I instructed the security desk. "Please escort her off the premises. If she resists, involve the police." I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and stood by the panoramic window, watching the gray clouds gather over Lake Michigan. I listened as the frantic pounding outside my door abruptly ceased, replaced by the muffled, authoritative voices of the Langham security team hauling my mother away. The legal reckoning that followed was a masterclass in systemic destruction. By Tuesday morning, the flash drive I had handed to Liam Vance had been thoroughly authenticated by independent forensic accountants. The Silicon Valley Titans didn't just walk away. They retaliated with the full, terrifying might of their legal departments. The Securities and Exchange Commission immediately froze every single account tied to Marcus's name, halting his desperate attempts to transfer his remaining dwindling funds offshore. On Thursday, the physical raid occurred. I watched the live broadcast on a local news channel from the quiet sanctuary of my Apex Equities corner office. Federal agents and windbreakers swarmed the sleek, glass-walled downtown headquarters of Marcus's startup. They carried out boxes of hard drives, server racks, and physical ledgers. And then the cameras caught Marcus. He was being led out of the glass double doors in handcuffs. The bespoke suits and arrogant visionary posturing were entirely gone. He was wearing a rumpled, sweat-stained dress shirt, his shoulders hunched, his face buried in his chest. As the local reporters shouted questions at him, the camera zoomed in, capturing the exact moment his fragile ego shattered. Marcus was weeping. Real, ugly, hyperventilating tears streamed down his pale face. He looked like a terrified, incompetent child being dragged to the principal's office, blubbering incoherently to the stoic federal agents that he didn't mean to do it, that it was all a misunderstanding, that he was just trying to keep the company afloat. It was a pathetic, whimpering end to a fraud built on my stolen future. But the federal net did not stop with my brother. The shadow ledgers didn't just reveal Marcus's gambling debts and embezzlement. They exposed the sprawling systemic rot of Eleanor's financial life. To secure the initial lines of credit that Marcus had subsequently drained, Eleanor had co-signed the documents. She had actively participated in forging the signatures of the fictitious board members. 3 days after Marcus was denied bail as a flight risk, the Department of Justice handed down Eleanor's indictment. Identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. The authorities immediately placed liens on her personal accounts. Her platinum credit cards were declined at the grocery store. Her country club membership was revoked, pending criminal investigation. The high society friends who had sipped her champagne and praised her maternal devotion vanished overnight, treating the Wilson name like a highly contagious disease. With their accounts frozen and the stolen seed money completely gone, the reality of their fabricated wealth came crashing down. The sprawling palatial suburban mansion, the crown jewel of Eleanor's vanity, the very house where I had been treated like a second-class citizen for 18 years, was built on a mountain of leveraged debt. Without the massive, fraudulent influx of cash Marcus had promised from his Series B funding, Eleanor missed her third consecutive mortgage payment. The bank, seeing the federal indictments and realizing the estate was tied up in a massive criminal enterprise, moved with ruthless efficiency. They foreclosed on the property. The mansion went up for public auction exactly 1 month later. It was a cold, biting morning when the property was listed at the Cook County Courthouse. I didn't attend the auction in person. That would have been an amateur move. Instead, I sat at my mahogany desk at Apex Equities, sipping a glass of sparkling water, listening through a secure conference line as my lead acquisitions attorney sat in the sterile courtroom. He was operating under a blind LLC I had established specifically for this purpose, Genesis Holdings. The bidding was brief. The property was heavily distressed by the surrounding scandal, and traditional buyers were hesitant to touch an estate currently being picked over by federal prosecutors. When the opening bid was announced, my attorney casually raised his paddle. $2.8 million. Cash offer. His voice echoed through my phone speaker. A heavy silence fell over the auction room. A cash offer of that magnitude, completely bypassing escrow or mortgage contingencies, was an absolute knockout blow. The auctioneer called for competing bids, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Going once, going twice. The sharp, definitive crack of the wooden gavel resonated through the phone line. Sold, the auctioneer announced. I leaned back in my leather chair, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. I had just bought my childhood prison with the very money Eleanor had thrown me out into the street to prevent me from earning. The bank gave Eleanor and Chloe exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. I decided to take this morning off. I instructed my driver to take my personal vehicle, a sleek armored midnight black SUV with heavily tinted windows, out to the suburbs. I didn't want to gloat. I didn't want to scream. I simply wanted to bear witness to the final, absolute conclusion of their reign. My driver pulled the SUV to a quiet stop across the street from the grand wrought iron gates of the estate, leaving the engine idling in the freezing Chicago air. Through the tinted glass, I watched the bitter, pathetic climax of Eleanor's life. There were no moving trucks. Their assets had been seized, leaving them with only what they could physically carry. Eleanor and Chloe were standing on the frost-covered sidewalk at the edge of the driveway. They were unrecognizable. Chloe, who had lost her wealthy politician fiancé and her dream wedding in the span of an hour, looked hollowed out, wearing a faded tracksuit, her hair pulled into a frantic bun. Eleanor stood beside her, shivering in her trench coat, clutching two oversized scuffed designer suitcases. They were entirely alone. The fleet of luxury vehicles was gone. The gardeners, the maids, the society friends, all of them had evaporated. They were standing on the curb, hauling their own luggage, desperately waiting for a cheap, discounted cab to take them to whatever cramped, rundown motel they had managed to secure with their last few dollars. My driver glanced back at me through the rearview mirror. "Ready, Miss Wilson?" "Yes," I murmured. "Pull into the driveway." The massive black SUV glided forward, its tires crunching softly against the frost. It crossed the street and turned directly into the grand, sweeping entrance of the estate. On the sidewalk, Eleanor and Chloe stepped back, their faces twisting in confusion and irritation as the imposing vehicle blocked their path to the street. Chloe scowled, stepping forward to wave the vehicle away, assuming it was a lost driver or a foreclosure agent coming to inspect the empty property. The SUV came to a smooth halt just inches from where they stood. Slowly, with a soft mechanical hum, the heavily tinted rear window began to glide down. Chloe's irritated scowl deepened as she peered into the dark interior of the vehicle. But as the glass lowered, revealing my face, her breath hitched. Her eyes went wide, locking onto mine, as I sat comfortably in the heated leather seat, looking out at the sprawling, magnificent estate that now belonged entirely to me. Chloe's mouth dropped open. She let out a ragged, suffocated gasp, her hands dropping to her sides as the absolute crushing reality of the moment finally hit her. The tinted glass of the window glided down with a soft mechanical hum, coming to a smooth halt. I didn't say a word. I simply sat in the heated leather seat of the SUV, my posture relaxed, meeting Chloe's horrified gaze. Her mouth dropped open. She let out a ragged, suffocated gasp, her hands falling limply to her sides. The absolute crushing reality of the moment slammed into her all at once. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and ghost-like in the freezing morning light. I unbuckled my seatbelt, pulled the collar of my tailored wool coat tight against the biting Chicago wind, and stepped out onto the frost-covered driveway. My heavy boots crunched softly against the pavement. Eleanor had been staring blankly down the street, searching for their cheap cab, but the sound of the SUV door closing made her turn. When her eyes landed on me, the scuffed designer suitcase slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the concrete with a dull, heavy thud. "Maya," Eleanor breathed. Her voice was thin, fragile, and laced with absolute confusion. She looked from me to the imposing black vehicle and then up at the sprawling, empty estate behind us. I could practically see the gears grinding in her panicked mind as she tried to make sense of the scene. And then a sickening, desperate spark of delusion lit up her tired eyes. She connected the dots regarding the anonymous buyer at the courthouse. "You bought it," Eleanor whispered, taking a hesitant half-step forward. You bought the house." I folded my hands in front of me, my expression entirely impassive. "I did." The survival instincts of a lifelong narcissist are a terrifying thing to witness. Within seconds, Eleanor had managed to spin this devastating reality into a lifeline. A strained, watery smile broke across her face, and she let out a breathless, hysterical laugh. "I knew it," she wept, pressing a hand to her chest. "I knew you wouldn't let the bank take our family home. You bought it for us. You couldn't let your own mother and sister be thrown out onto the street. I knew that underneath all the anger, Maya, you still cared. You came to bring us back inside." Chloe looked up, a pathetic, desperate flicker of hope washing over her sunken features. She actually took a step toward the SUV, as if expecting my driver to jump out and load her bags into the trunk. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at the woman who had spent 3 decades systematically trying to destroy my spirit. "I didn't buy this house for you, Eleanor." I said, my tone strictly business. The delusion shattered instantly. Eleanor's frail smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending terror. Then why?" Chloe choked out, her voice raspy and broken from days of crying. "Why would you buy it if you're not going to live in it?" I looked past them, up at the grand, imposing mahogany doors and the towering marble columns. The place where I had been treated like a ghost, a servant, an unwanted complication. "The demolition crews arrive at 6 a.m. on Monday," I stated, shifting my gaze back to them. "We are tearing the interior down to the studs. The grand ballroom, the formal dining room, the custom walk-in closets, all of it is going into a dumpster." Eleanor gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. "You're destroying it. You spent millions of dollars just to destroy our home out of spite." "I am repurposing it," I corrected her, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "Apex Equities is fully funding the renovation. This property is being converted into a transitional housing and education facility for at-risk youth. Specifically, it will serve teenagers who have been unexpectedly thrown out of their homes with nothing but a trash bag, providing them with shelter, resources, and a foundation to build their own wealth." The blood completely drained from Eleanor's face. Her knees visibly buckled. The poetic, undeniable justice of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. I was taking her ultimate monument to vanity, the very symbol of her exclusionary, elitist existence, and turning it into a sanctuary for the exact type of victim she had made me. It was a total, systematic erasure of her legacy. "You're a monster," Chloe whispered, wrapping her arms around herself as she shivered in the cold. "No," I replied softly. "I'm just the architect of my own life." I looked down at my watch. "Your foreclosure eviction notice expired at 8 a.m. It is currently 8:15. You are trespassing on private property." Down the street, the rattling hum of a battered yellow minivan taxi broke the morning silence. Its brakes squealed loudly as it pulled up to the curb, parking directly behind my armored SUV. "You have exactly 5 minutes to get off my property before my security team physically removes you," I said, my voice dropping the last degree of warmth. Chloe didn't argue. She didn't scream. The fight had been entirely drained out of her. She let out a pathetic, broken sob, grabbed the handle of her scuffed suitcase, and dragged it toward the idling taxi without a single backward glance. Eleanor stood frozen on the frost-covered sidewalk. She looked at the sprawling mansion, then at the cheap minivan, and finally, she looked at me. There were no more threats to hurl. There was no more manipulation to deploy. The matriarch was dead, defeated by the very daughter she had tried to bury. She slowly reached down, her shoulders slumped in utter defeat, picked up her bag and shuffled toward the taxi. The heavy sliding door of the minivan slammed shut. The exhaust sputtered a cloud of gray smoke into the freezing air, and the taxi rattled down the street, disappearing around the corner, blending into the endless sea of morning traffic. They were gone. Into obscurity. Into the exact life they had always believed I deserved. I turned away from the street and walked up the wide stone steps of the estate. The heavy front doors were unlocked. I pushed them open, stepping over the threshold into the grand foyer. It was completely, breathtakingly empty. There were no priceless antique rugs, no imported vases, no crystal chandeliers glaring overhead. The house had been stripped of all its pretentious, suffocating armor. It was just bare hardwood floors, white walls, and echoing open space. I walked slowly through the rooms. I stood in the dining room where I had been ignored for 18 years. I walked down the hallway where Marcus used to shoulder check me and mock my clothes. I stepped into the study where Eleanor had spitefully destroyed my father's true wishes. I waited for the familiar tightness in my chest. I waited for the heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood trauma to press down on my shoulders. But it never came. The walls had no power over me anymore. The ghosts that had haunted my memories were silenced. The deep burning anger that had fueled my grueling 80-hour work weeks, the relentless need for vengeance that had kept me awake at night, it all began to evaporate. It drifted up into the vaulted ceilings and vanished, leaving behind a profound, unshakable peace. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the cold, clean air, filtering in through the open front doors. I was finally, truly free. 6 months later, the view from my penthouse at the Langham was bathed in the warm, golden light of a summer evening. The expansive suite was filled with the low, pleasant hum of genuine laughter and clinking glasses. I was hosting a private celebration to mark the official opening of the Genesis Youth Foundation facility. The renovation had been a massive success, transforming the suburban estate into a state-of-the-art campus. I stood by the panoramic window looking out over the glittering skyline of Chicago, a glass of sparkling water in my hand. "You're hiding in the corner at your own party," a deep, familiar voice said. I turned to see Liam Vance approaching 2 flutes of champagne in his hands. He offered one to me. Over the past 6 months after the dust of Marcus's federal indictment had settled, Liam and I had transitioned from cautious allies into fierce, trusted business partners. His venture capital firm was now co-funding 3 of my latest acquisitions. "I'm not hiding," I smiled, accepting the glass. "Just taking it all in." Liam looked out at the room. My lead attorneys were sharing a joke with the lead architect who had designed the transitional housing facility. My private security contractors were casually swapping stories by the catering spread. There were no fake smiles, no desperate social climbing, no toxic manipulation. Everyone in this room had earned their place through loyalty, competence, and mutual respect. "It's a good crowd," Liam noted softly, clinking his glass against mine. "You built a hell of a team, Maya." "I built a family," I corrected him, taking a sip of the crisp champagne. I looked back out at the city. The Wilson name was a distant, faded memory, buried under federal indictments and bankruptcy filings. But I wasn't a Wilson anymore. I was Maya. I was the woman who had walked out into the cold with nothing but a trash bag and returned to buy the very ground my abusers stood on. I took one last look at the stars emerging over Lake Michigan, feeling the absolute, undeniable certainty that the best years of my life had finally begun.